Wanted to share how much I enjoyed your third week discussion. I'm talking to the section two of 804, um, and your discussion about your culture from Alaska, Braden, when you're talking about Alaska and your time up there and hunting, which really struck me as interesting how it come up in both classes. Hunting was a huge issue. I would I've not thought about it. I've never hunted, or I haven't hunted for so many years. It didn't even come up to me. But it's interesting that you mentioned that and wildlife and ecology. Um, a lot of people also talked about issues like food, gardening, pesticides versus organic. At least they mention it. Shows they're concerned about it and how good it is to pick your own grapes and have your canned goods. Brenda, you mentioned that in one of your responses. Um, and McKenna, you mentioned that too. You're talking about having reunions and sharing food, and it felt very. What's the word? The word might be called bucolic in the old days, which meant countryside, but I would also call it agricultural. And it sounds like old times back on the farm, which I grew up on. I was never around close family, or at least my families were never close to each other, but we did have we were close to our neighbors. And this was also echoed by Zaida, that when you were talking about being bilingual, but how going back to Mexico it was very interesting. And then the term greeting came up, and I remember, and I can't remember if it's in this section or the other one, but people said that depending on where you are, you're not supposed to greet people you don't know, or you are supposed to greet people you don't know. It depends. Certainly in large cities, I've heard that if you're in a subway in New York or in other places, you don't really stare at other people and make contact with them and talk to them, because it becomes an issue. And so an assumption that everybody could be your friend or that it's nice to say hello to people would be considered naive in other parts of American culture, not just in other countries. Also, compassion came up a lot in here because there was talk about the flood issues. In Nebraska, been a lot of floods. In fact, the weather's been a problem in many places. The Atlantic with hurricanes, and also in Asia. Some of the typhoons I know have been very serious. So a lot of issues here with nature. I may have to pause this, but I thought that was very interesting that that nature came up either between flooding or between organic food, and there's a lot of food mentioned in all these. So food's obviously a big deal in American culture. I mean, it is in many cultures, but raising food and having your own fresh food, it's interesting because when you look on those, when you try to see bridges between so-called American culture, Nebraska culture, wherever you are, and Mexican culture or Hispanic culture, nature is a very common thing, especially raising good natural food, going to the markets. I always enjoyed going to the markets in Latin America. Much more interesting and alive than it is going to a grocery store or Walmart and finding, oh, the peaches are here. Well, they look really good. They're not particularly tasty. Things like that I think make a difference. There's quite a bit of attention paid to being on time. About that in Latin America or in some cultures, being late is almost expected. But a lot of the farm families, if you're supposed to be somewhere for grandma's house at dinner at 2, you better be there about 15 minutes early, because if you're on time, that's late. Now, that's really pushing it, in my opinion. If I'm there on time a couple of minutes early, I feel like that's not late. But people connect that with being respectful. And I was invited to a party once in Latin America, and I showed up about half an hour early because I wanted to be there in time. Of course, I didn't have much to do. And it actually embarrassed the host because I was there before they were ready. So it was kind of embarrassing. And I realized, I should have come late. I got up early this morning, so I'm a little sleepy. There's also a deep spiritual thread that runs through these discussions: compassion for people that have gone through the flood, or passion for people that have had some kind of suffering, that people may in a small town be judgmental of you, but they'll still help you. They won't just walk away and ignore your plight. They feel obligated to help you, even if they don't seem to really care for you, but they're still going to help because you are in a small town. Alex, you mentioned this about how kids behave either at home or when they're visiting other people. And it was Alex, you mentioned this, it was very, very strict. I mean, you better behave yourself if you're at somebody else's house. And if you misbehave, it's an embarrassment for the whole family, and you'll be taken aside and scolded and talked to about it. Same thing about cleanliness. Everything being in its place. I happen to like that because I've just gone through a garage sale and we're having an argument about getting rid of things. I mean, you know what that is. Somebody had mentioned in here their grandmother, who was German, which would be my wife's family too, were like that they would take the foil off old containers of butter when they were done with them, and they would save the foil plus the containers. That really shocked me. I said, they saved the foil too? So this idea of being careful not to waste things is a distinct characteristic of, and I often connect it with the Great Depression, that people are poor and that they literally didn't have anything. So material things, not because they were greedy and they wanted them to be wealthy or to be arrogant about it or prideful about it, but they literally saved everything. And so you go around looking, and people say in this house, their great aunt saved every butter pack or plastic butter container for the last 20 years, and they'd be stacked everywhere. It's too bad we don't recycle things. I've heard that recycling is not very profitable now, so people are arguing about that. And then we have the religion. And it's funny, it seemed like most were careful about religion to respect it, but didn't necessarily go to church that much. But they felt what was important was to be spiritual and to be respectful of other people and to help those that need help. A couple of really good ones. One I noticed was Tanner. Talked about tipping. If you tip in the wrong place, it's an insult because people think you're tipping because you feel sorry for them, and you're actually insulting them by giving a little extra money. And in other places, if you didn't tip or didn't tip enough, it was an insult because they expected tips. And I had that happen to me once in Monterrey, Mexico, that I didn't tip enough, and I was scolded and told that what you left here is like a nickel in American money. And, obviously the waiter expected to get paid more than that. I didn't get the 15%. I think I hit 15 cents. Or maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it was these teenagers from Iowa I was with. But people, when they stereotype, and I also enjoyed, Tanner, you talk about that you live in a small town, but you don't listen to country music. You don't care for football, and you're not into farm life or the ranch life. Which tells us what? Tells us that stereotypes won't fit you, and we should never use them, because we walk into a small town and we assume that they live for football and Buck Owens. Well, Buck Owens is dated. I'm sorry, he died. So it would be the people, who was the guy on America's Got Talent, but The Voice. you know. You know what I'm talking about if you watch TV. But point is, there's certain country people that we like. Dolly Parton was in my time was Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn. Now, of course, they're older, but they're still around, but they're not singing quite as much. And you mentioned that term, Tanner, you mentioned a term in live and let live, as opposed to don't, leave people alone with their own beliefs, don't interfere, give them their space. I like that too. That's why I wear the dude. Ta-da! If you don't know what this is, you have to look it up on Google. It has its own cultural context. Excellent remarks back to each other. I liked something very funny when Kelly mentioned it. She thought about it and said, I don't have any culture. What's culture? Well, we don't have it because what's culture to us, it's like asking, what was the one I saw one time? It's like trying to explain weather to a fish in an aquarium. His weather is the water around him. So he doesn't think about being in an aquarium is what it is. And if you explain the concept of weather with air and stuff, that's totally outside of his thing. His weather is the ocean. Another interesting one, work and money and working hard. Stephanie, you mentioned that, and I think I'd written down, and some of these, it came up in one of these about, sometimes people choose hard work and making money over family time because we constantly make choices, and sometimes we choose what I would say is an imbalance, going too much to get money, thinking that that's gonna, that's the most precious thing. I always think time with family is more important. But of course, I don't follow that a lot of times. I'm always doing something else. And I really enjoyed, Brenda, when you mentioned about somebody, they got a blanket, but it didn't have the scent of being home. I must take this new blanket and wash it in our house so that it has the fabric softener smell that I'm used to, Kind of reminds me, people are kind of like animals. Animals like to sit on the pillow that they're familiar with. I have a cat like that, and if it's a new pillow, the cat doesn't know what to do with it. Once the cat's used it a while and has a scent on it, then the cat wants to sit on the pillow. It's like we want to break it in, It's like an old baseball glove. You used to get a baseball glove and you'd try to put the baseball in and tie it up. So when you went out and played a game, it felt like your glove and you could put it on and it fit like a glove, literally. So I really enjoy a lot of these. Haley, you mentioned budgeting, how important budgeting was, planning ahead. Kind of remind me of the Dutch one, and somebody else mentioned about their Dutch relatives in the other class, and that you had to budget, or you have to budget your time. So you don't have the option of just saying, I'm just going to show up and be over at the house and visit with grandma. I have to plan ahead. Now, some people, reminds me of a Seinfeld episode, but some people, he would say to his Uncle Leo, he said, I got to be somewhere. And Uncle Leo said, no, let me stop you. Go ahead. Just because you're not friendly to talk to me. And he said, no, I really have to be somewhere. And so some people think you have time. I have a relative, a sister-in-law, but when she would go somewhere and then she didn't get back very fast, and people say, oh, she's ran into some people and she always talks. So that is a country thing. Being on time is important, but for a lot of country people and stuff, taking your time and not being in too big a hurry, taking the time to say hello and pass a little time with people and not worrying about the clock. So you get this tension there. I want to be someplace on time, but on the other hand, I don't want to be disrespectful to my neighbor if they come by and talk. And then I love the Brenda's mention about, and I mentioned this in the other class, what you wrote about your grandparents' farm and the culture of the farm and what people need to do to survive, and how the family went to the funeral, and basically it sounds very self-reliant. The family, some people probably cooked the food, but the family made sure to clean and put away the dishes in the church. And that was the way it was. And if you ever want to read this, people, in this class, Brenda's talk about her grandmother, it's really beautiful. Captures the realness of that culture. Because I've been to those places where you had a funeral and then people would, and there was a social life at church or in the church basement afterwards. Life continued. There was a funeral and people were grieving, but they stopped. They had food. I always thought that was odd. People would have something to eat at the funeral or right after the funeral. I understand they do, and that's very common, but I just thought it was odd. I never thought of going to a funeral and then being hungry. It just, those two things didn't happen for me there. That was my own particular version of my culture. I'm really enjoyed Jorge's talk about Colombia. I would recommend this as a reading, people to find out about Caleños, the name of the people born in Cali, Colombia. Everybody's salsas. It used to be in the country, everybody square danced. Probably not very common now. Maybe you polka up there in Loop City, if anybody knows about Loop City, Nebraska, Polish culture, or German culture, depending on where you go. I like it, and you mentioned it in here, Jorge. Young people of Cali live in the eternal present time, and elders live in the past time, yearning for a time where life conditions were better for them. That's true. In some countries, well, it depends on the condition, but for some people, the past is when the best time was. And when you're older, you think about the past a lot. You don't say you're older and I'm thinking about all the exciting times I'm going to have in the nursing home. I can't wait to find out what they're having on Sunday night for the cake. When we all go to bed about 8 o'clock and the football game is only in the first quarter. That's my nightmare. But what's interesting here is you talk about education and macho culture. And so you reveal some things. I think that dance is very important. Physical movement is something that is not as prevalent in, I call, agriculture. Now, I know country music has music. I don't consider line dancing. Okay, you're going to get mad. Oh, it's dancing, Okay. But I do love disco. Disco rules. I know you object. You can see I'm a product of a certain cultural time, just like this dude. I want to get one of these things like I get for my job. It says Glenn Tracy, University of Nebraska. I want to get one of these things with a little magnet on it, and it just says the dude. I think that'd be cool. I really enjoyed hearing about Michigan. I heard about Michigan in the other class, about the hand. This is Michigan. This is Upper Michigan. I had a guy, oh gosh, what is his name in the other class? He'll come to me after I go off this. Natalie, you mentioned Fullerton being a Polish community. And how hardworking it is, being very social and family is number one in Fullerton. And the whole, this sounds like a lot of Nebraska towns, only it might have been German, it might have been Czech, it might have been Irish or something. People help people. That's what you do in small towns. And if you happen to be Polish, you do that. If you happen to be Irish, you do that. If you happen to be a mix, you do that. Respect, you have to earn respect. You don't just get it. Now, being elderly, I like to just get respect for being older. That's a joke. Okay. And then I like the comments, Stephanie, you mentioned about your Italian family. And that was really cool. I enjoyed that contrast. I mentioned it in the other class. Joe Jensen, you mentioned about that you're bicultural. Wow. Did your mother meet Burt Reynolds? I wonder. Worked at Disney, Burt Reynolds, and upholstery. I'm assuming this is all in Florida. It must be, right? Because you live there. I'm trying to just remember as I'm reading through everything. And the military being a great experience. And then you're in Japan. And it was so interesting reading about the Japanese culture and really how Japanese culture, and I remember it had to do with the work deals you mentioned in here, that if you're an outsider or gaijin, that the labor rules that apply to the workers do not apply to you. You don't have protection of law if you're a foreigner. And that's the practice. It may not be the law, but it's the practice. And you know how it is. That you talk about the hidden curriculum in schools. There's the rules, and then there's the rules for certain people that don't get enforced or do get enforced, depending on which side you're on. And but you mentioned this about, and this is an interesting concept. This is so cool. Because when you live in another culture, you have to figure out, can I compromise? Can I live in that culture under those conditions? Depending on how you're treated, you may say, no, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this for a long term, or maybe you can. But a good way to think about this, and if you've read his experience, he talks about this, is that it is, should I be saying he? Now I'm thinking about it. I guess I took too much sinus medicine. I'm sorry, but anyhow, Joe. The nail sticking out gets hammered, and that in Japan, those that are a little different have to adjust, or they will be told to follow the rules that everybody's following. Interesting. Yeah, I would recommend that you look at Joe Jensen's entry. It's toward the end. Has a lot of good stuff, particularly if you're interested in Japan. I think Joe has a lot to share about Japan. So, huge amount of cultural information there. Sometimes it just falls out. And then I get Shane here, and you're in Moscow, but it's Moscow, I was told by my previous former ex-Russian daughter-in-law that it's not Moscow, it's Moscow. Okay. I'm not a big fan of Russian government right now. Anyhow, but we're talking Moscow, Kansas. Maybe it is Moscow because you have cows there. Being on time. And tipping came up again. This is very interesting here. People, and in religion, and this again is one of those compromises I just mentioned. Joe is dealing with in Japan about the work conditions, and here is dealing about religion and whether you marry within the church and what church you follow. If you come out and say I'm an atheist, or if you come out and say I'm an agnostic, and everybody has to look that up. They say, what is that? Good stuff there, Michelle. Really, you and gosh, you and Braden had a really stuff that I would just say read it. It's outstanding stories to tell about the complexity of culture and the decisions you had to make, and that was tough, you know. And I'm just gonna let people read about it if they want to. If they read that, I really thought about both of these struck me, and the Japanese one too. I spent quite a bit of time pondering these. And then finally, Kayla, we talk about Phillips. Is that Phillips, Nebraska? It must be. Big gardens. I hate big gardens because I used to have to pick everything in the big gardens. Strawberries in Missouri in July. Oh my gosh, it was hot and muddy and steamy. Anybody knows about Missouri, it's kind of like Mississippi, only a little cooler, but not that much cooler. And then again, we come into some of these, we talk about lateness again. I think you mentioned that in yours, Kayla, about a lot of people are very concerned about being late or being on time, which is considered late. Now, see, I had not heard that before very much, but apparently it's a big deal. I'm probably a slob when it comes to time. That's why I like online, because we're not sitting here saying you have to be here at a certain time. Online kind of throws all of that into the chaos. It messes up my day because I come in late and I stay late. Most of you are not going. You're busy. You're not even looking at your stuff, and 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning is not a time to interact with online students. I like Rachel mentioned about your culture has a mix of different beliefs and different about time, collectivism, eating healthy and clean. Now that's an interesting thing. I noticed when I was in Oklahoma, people ate fast food all the time. I had heard that they tested fast food restaurants and new recipes in Oklahoma because so many people eat in their car that they just do. And why is that? Because they like cars and because people like to be racing around their cars, and sometimes they don't eat at home or sometimes they're working. And I could talk for days about Oklahoma culture, but I can say food is a big one. Oil business is a big one. I'm concerned about the level of corruption in the state, mainly because the state has been make a lot of money very quickly and then lose it and spend it and then try to make a lot of money again because they were waiting for the oil boom. You know how the 49ers and people went to California to make money off the gold fields and how chaotic it was. You know, if you haven't read it, it was. Anytime you have an economy based on a certain resource and you have to get a lot of it out of the ground at a certain time in order to make money. And then when the prices go down, everybody kind of goes broke and goes away to something else. And then they come racing back. Well, that's a boom or bust economy, and it's not healthy. You can imagine if agriculture were like that you could make a lot of money raising corn and soybeans for 5 years, and then you go 10 years and you can't make any money. Well, the fact is that actually happens, but the farmers can't take off and leave their farm. They have to stay there, good or bad. But people that work the oil fields, or people that work the gold fields, or people that work in some kind of a business where there's a retail or something where there's a lot of demand and then it goes away and then it comes back. There's a lot of movement, and movement means instability and a lot of mobility. And so students and a lot of people be in town and suddenly demand drops and half the people are gone. And it's very difficult to plan a budget. It's difficult on education. It's very hard on teachers. But you mentioned nutrition, and I just thought about that. That's not something Oklahoma's famous for. I'll get in trouble for this, but that's okay. I lived in Oklahoma for 14 years. I'm allowed to have an opinion. Okay. Well, the last thing I want to mention, I got a couple of more people. You mentioned about Sarah. I don't mention her first name. I always got it. Alyssa. You mentioned about tap water and the water tastes awful. You know, I thought so. I just moved to Kearney and I thought it was odd. I'm going to have to get, what is it? Culligan. Yeah, Culligan. I want to say Gilligan's Island. But yeah, I've noticed that depending on where you are, the water's hard. I know when I do the dishes, I can't. The dishes, the stuff always looks smudged a little bit because the water's too hard. So I'm going to have to get soft water. I had it over at the other place, but not here. And you also mentioned the times. You're in Dominican Republic for your honeymoon, and it's kind of like Costa Rica, you know. I mentioned that before. And schedules, all kinds of schedules. And finally, I have Kylie. And I really think it's interesting, the combination of Vietnamese and Buddhism with maybe it's Catholicism or stuff like that, or religions, very different religions. Czech Republic. It's such a fascinating. You live the bicultural lifestyle. You're mixing and matching, and that to me is fascinating. People are either doing it because of their marriage or doing it because they live a place and they have to kind of balance off two cultures. Lexington's like that. I lived in Lexington for many years, 20 years. And Lexington's a combination of old Nebraska and new Nebraska with Hispanic, and now it's got Somali. And what is Somali? Well, it's African tribal people on the east coast of Africa, Muslims. And so downtown, they have a bar that has a parking lot, and they have some spaces. And then there's something, used to be a washroom, a laundry, and a pool hall. It is now a mosque, or used as a mosque. It doesn't have all the, structure of a mosque. It's just a building. So people come down there and they pray. And then they had to settle where they're going to have the mosque. And it was kind of touch and go. It was a little sensitive in Lex. But they settled it. But there was a problem because people would come to the mosque Friday evening, and people would come down to go to the buffet and drink beer on Friday evening. And then there was a problem with parking. I thought it was really interesting. It's a cultural clash. We want to go to the bar or pub and eat fried chicken and biscuits and gravy or whatever, pizza, and have a beer and watch Friday night, whatever's on TV, baseball or football, whatever. And then the other people were coming to pray. But they happened to be doing it downtown because they didn't have a church like most people assume you have church. They had to use a building downtown that was available to them. So living biculturally could be a whole topic. Okay, I got to shut up. I know I talked too long. But thank you for this really wonderful discussion. A+, really enjoyed it. And it's great reading, and I suggest you read some of the things I mentioned.